In 1915, Detroit was already 214 years old, and the world was at war. The city was a manufacturing powerhouse and a destination for thousands of migrants and immigrants, and an adopted son of the city gave the people of Detroit a vision for their future by preserving the past. His collection of hundreds of thousands of documents, letters, books, and maps tell the story of how a French fur trading colony had transformed into one of the world's greatest industrial centers.
Clarence Burton was born in 1852 and died in 1933. He was a lawyer and a businessman who founded the Burton Abstract and Title Company. He also got his law degree from the University of Michigan, and while attending a class, he was inspired by a lecturer who said that every man should have an avocation. And Burton's chosen avocation was to collect documents and books on American history every day of his life. And he would root around in basements and attics and outbuildings looking for historical documents to preserve that detailed our history. And so he amassed a tremendous collection in his house, at a house on Brainerd Street in Detroit. It doesn't exist anymore. But in 1914, he approached the library and asked if they would accept the donation of his collection. In 1915, the collection opened for public use, and so we're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. It took about 4 or 5 years for the main library building on Woodward Avenue to be completed, and that was completed in 1921, and that's when the collection moved to the building. Actually, we're in this building right now. So for the first 4 or 5 years, you actually went to Mr. Burton's house where library staff would help you. What he did was he sold the house, and he took the entire proceeds and gave it to the library to establish an endowment for the collection, the Burton Endowment. And that remains today, and that's what allows us to continue to purchase materials. Can't be used for anything else except for acquisition. The papers of William Woodbridge, who was Michigan's first delegate to Congress and a territorial governor. He found his papers in a abandoned outbuilding. And the papers of John Askin, who was a well-known Detroit businessman in the late 18th century, early 19th century, fur trader and businessman. He found his papers in a abandoned chicken coop. The collection is pretty far-ranging. At its core, the Burton Collection is truly an Americana collection with documents from everything from the Civil War to the westward expansion and the Lewis and Clark expedition. Although it's fundamentally most focused on Detroit and Michigan and the Great Lakes region and Upper Canada, because it all ties into the history of early Detroit. It's about 500,000 books, about 300,000 photographs and postcards, 700 bound newspapers, and about 4,000 manuscript collections, letters, diaries of an individual, or the records of a group, organization, government. In fact, the Burton Collection is the designated repository for the City of Detroit government record. In May, we had the grand opening of the Coleman Young papers with a panel discussion, and it was also a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the collection, and we were also recognized with a certificate and a plaque by the Historical Society of Michigan. We also put together a booklet covering not only the genesis of the collection, but also the treasures of the collection. We selected about 25 treasures. It's available for purchase for $10 from the Detroit Public Library Friends Foundation.
Since 1915, the Burton Collection has acquired thousands of historic documents and publications detailing the transformation of the city, the state, and the Great Lakes from a wilderness frontier to a world-renowned industrial powerhouse. The Burton Collection can also bring the stories of everyday people back to life to help us find out who they were, where they lived, and what they did.
Another component of Burton Collection is our genealogical collection, which is worldwide in scope. It's strongest, of course, in Detroit, Michigan, but we have material on virtually every country, every ethnic group, marriage, birth and death indexes, land records, military records, and newspapers. It's very far-ranging, and genealogy is an important component of what we do in the Burton Collection.
The Burton's genealogy collection, as Mark points out, is vast. So where do you start? Assistant manager of the Burton Special Collections, Romie Minor, shows us one place. What are we looking at right here? This is a pretty darn thick book. What is it?
It's actually an R.O. Polk Detroit City directory. R.O. Polk and Company did directories not only in Detroit but across the country. And it's a cross-index directory, which is great. This particular one, what people love about it, it's an alphabetical listing of names.
Okay.
Last names, and actually it's alphabetical of companies. So if you want to know where the company was located in 1913, you can just look it up in the front.
If you know the name?
If you know the name.
Okay.
As well as, since we do a lot of genealogy, that's what people come in for, they can locate where their family members lived. Also, if they bought a home, currently in Detroit, and it was built around that time, or existed around that time, they can find out who was the first owner.
Okay.
So that's the front of it. The back of it, which is really great, is a street index, alphabetical by street name.
Okay.
So all I have is the address. Don't know their name. I do have an address of the home I just built. We can go right back and look at that address to see who was there.
So this is a tremendous resource for people doing genealogy.
Correct.
Yeah.
And what it tells you is, it'll tell you the person who lived at a certain location. Usually it's the head of household. And then it will have like the wife's name in parentheses.
Okay.
It'll tell you what the occupation was at that time.
Okay.
And sometimes it'll tell you where they worked at. And then it'll give you their home address, which is usually an H or maybe an R, either where they roomed at or rented at that time.
Okay.
695 says that this particular person, who people may or may not know, Tyrus R. Cobb.
Familiar with that name.
It says baseball player. I don't know who he played for in this game. Of course, the great Hall of Famer Ty Cobb. He lived at 103 Commonwealth. That's where his home was in 1913 in Detroit.
Wow.
Sometimes people come in and they say, well, I'm a relative. I don't know if, say it's multiple listings of the same name. We can check the occupation. Well, I know he was a Detroit police officer. He'll say police officer or worked for one of the automobile companies. So this is great. Now, if you happen to be prominent, especially for a lot of the businesses are in bold, but this particular person is very prominent. It says Henry Ford, President Ford Motor Company, and it gives his address when he lived on Edison Street in Detroit at the time. So if you're prominent, you will get
a little bit more
top billing on there. So, but this is a great resource for people.
That is so cool. I don't think Justin Verlander would want his name published in the directory. With over 300 years of history, the story of Detroit is preserved and shared in letters, books, maps, and beads.
All right, so Mark, we all know Detroit is essentially a French city. But eventually the French ceded control to the British after the 7 Years' War?
7 Years' War, right.
And then once the British were in control, their relationship with the natives weren't quite what it was with the French, right?
No, they weren't nearly as friendly. It was not nearly as friendly and cooperative relationship as they had with the French. The Native Americans much preferred the French to the British. And so after a few years, Pontiac put together a coalition of warriors among different tribes to try and take over the forts in the region and oust the British. And one of the forts that he tried this with was Fort Detroit. His plan is to go into the fort, meet with Major Gladwin under a friendly guise, a meeting. On Pontiac's signal, they would launch a surprise attack from within. In any case, Gladwin was aware of Pontiac's intentions. When Pontiac first came into the fort, he immediately knew that his surprise was known because Gladwin met him with his officers with their swords and sidearms on. From there, Pontiac was allowed to leave the fort, and they laid the fort under siege. It lasted from May until about November, when eventually they gave up.
So what do we know of the conditions within the fort during this period?
Well, what we do know is written here. This is called the Journal of Pontiac's Conspiracy, and we believe it was written by the French notary Robert Navarre. and it's from May to July.
Is there more that's missing, or?
Yeah, I don't know if he stopped writing or if that part of the journal was lost. I'm not sure on that. But in any case, he keeps this journal of conditions in the fort and what's going on, so that they can't be starved out because they're getting resupplied. And eventually, the Native Americans, they begin to lose interest, and they also have to get back to prepare for the winter.
So how did the Detroit Public Library, or the Burton Collection in specific, come by this amazing artifact?
This journal at one time was well known. It was in the hands of Lewis Cass, and he had it and lent it to Francis Parkman, who wrote his monumental history of the U.S., and he has a section on the Pontiac conspiracy, and he based it on this journal. But at some point it becomes lost for about 30, 40 years, and Clarence Burton knows that a judge has passed in the area. He goes to his house to clean up, pick up historical documents. The family allows him to come in literally with a pitchfork and barrels. And one of the things he comes across is the journal here. And so he rediscovers the journal and brings it, makes it part of his collection, which eventually comes to the library.
Is this actually paper, or is this parchment or anything? What is this actually written
what
on?
this is on, this is actually on paper, like a woolen paper, has wool or cotton paper, and the original pages are placed on there, because you can see how fragile they were and kind of ragged. So it's preserved in this book form.
So, Romie, what do we have here? This is kind of unique.
Yeah, this is the actual wampum belt. What it is the Belle Isle deed.
The deed to Belle Isle.
Deed to Belle Isle, right here. This is it. The whole island. This is the deed.
Okay.
Belle Isle was purchased by the British in 1769. Lieutenant George McDougall actually made the purchase from the Ottawa and Chippewa Nation, who actually owned the property. When Cadillac founded Detroit, the island was Hog Island at that time. And people used to have their hogs and what other animals they used to graze. 9 years later, after the British had taken over Detroit, it stopped.
Okay.
And then the island actually purchased from the Ottawa and Chippewa nations for the sum of 194 pounds sterling, which included 8 pounds of rum, 3 rolls of tobacco,
Okay.
and 6 pounds of vermilion, which was the red pigment that you see in paint.
Okay.
And they got the island.
So the native tribes, the negotiators,
Right.
presented this to McDougall.
McDougall,
Okay.
and along with the document that the British also had, the English version,
Okay.
along with the totems of each of the chiefs that you can see each of the chiefs' totems that are on the documents as well.
Wow. And this is, you said, what year?
I think it was May 5th, 1769.
Wow.
And the island was later purchased by William Macomb, and eventually Barnabas Campo purchased the island later, and it stayed within the Campo family. He died in 1845, and it went to his kids, his 2 sons and 2 daughters, until it was purchased by the city of Detroit for $180,000 in 1875.
Wow, that's some appreciation.
Yeah.
How do we know how the wampum belt stayed in one piece? I mean, do the different owners have any records of, hey, we got this belt?
It ended up with the Campo family, so I guess once William Macomb had purchased it, I guess they said, hey, this is it with the wampum belt.
Okay.
And eventually when Campo purchased it,
It traveled with it.
It traveled with it, said, here it is, and I think it stayed within the Campo family.
Well, it kind of makes sense because by the timeline, Michigan and the government are still negotiating with tribes for land in Michigan. So this really is the only legal documentation to say what the property is,
and
how it
and
was transferred over
yes,
time.
and this is what they use. This is primary use. what they use for the land transactions.
That is so cool. Awesome. The Burton Collection preserves the enduring legacy of the city and its people, from slavery and the Underground Railroad to presidents and Elvis.
So Mark, the image that most people have of Abraham Lincoln in their head is sort of a gaunt man with a kind of patchy black beard, but he didn't always have the beard, did he?
No, he did not. In fact, he only had the beard for the last 5 years of his life. When he started running for president in 1860, he was on a campaign trail. He was in upstate New York. And in attendance was a man and some of his sons, and they went home and they brought home some campaign literature. And this man's 11-year-old daughter saw it, and she was impressed with the image. Her name was Grace Bedell. In October of 1860, she wrote this letter, and she introduces herself as a little girl, and if inquires to Lincoln about his family, and if he has any girls, to send them her love, and ask them to write back to her. But then she gets into the point of writing the letter, which is she wants Abraham Lincoln to be president. But she sees his picture and she thinks his face is too thin, and that he would look better and it would fill out his face if he grew a beard. And she advises him that all the women like whiskers, and that they would tease their husbands to vote for the candidate with whiskers, because at this time women can't vote. Grace is very perceptive here, understanding how politics really works. It's through the wife to the husband. So America's first female pundit was an 11-year-old. That's right. Political advisor, savvy political advisor.
So, Romie, this is a very large bound volume of what appears to be a newspaper. What is the Voice of the Fugitive?
The Voice of the Fugitive is a Canadian publication, abolitionist newspaper.
Okay.
Was only published between 1851 and 1853. And the publisher was Henry Bibb, born in 1850 in Kentucky as a slave. At the age of 10, he was basically done with it. So he escaped the first time, and he did it several times. When he got to Detroit, he was able to get at one of the Underground Railroad stops, one of the main ones, which was Second Baptist Church here in Detroit. So he was able to get clothing and food and everything. He eventually went to Canada and started this Voice of the Fugitive. It was a place where families could actually correspond.
Oh, okay.
So we had that. And he actually did solicit funds from the newspaper to set up fugitive homes for slaves in Canada.
What's the impact of a paper like this?
At that time, and we're talking at least 10 years before Civil War started, you had the abolitionists in the North. And this was one of the papers, and it gave you news around the world as well. They were getting the message out there.
Okay.
And this was a person who felt that his experience, and he did write his autobiography in 1850, was to let people know that, for me, it was to let people know there was light.
So this is Henry Bibb's autobiography from, when did he publish it?
1850, The Life and Adventure of Henry Bibb, an American Slave.
Okay.
So when he came to Detroit, even though he had some schooling here, he was basically self-taught. So this is a picture of him, and eventually up to Canada to start the Voice of the Fugitive.
Wow. That is fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, welcome.
Detroit has been a destination for entertainers for a long time. And I understand that the Burton Collection has some photos of some interesting celebrities like the one you have here.
Right. About 2 years ago, I got a phone call from a lady who was offering some scrapbooks. And these are all women from the women's division.
Now, when you say women's division, these are all officers.
Police officers, yes.
Wow.
Pistol wielding.
And this year is?
Well, interestingly enough, that's all the information that I had. I knew it was Elvis in Detroit sometime in the 50s. I discovered that Elvis played Detroit twice in the 50s, once in 1956 at the Fox on 2 separate days, May 31st, 1957, He was at Olympia. So I got two choices here. Which is it? Is this 56 or 57? Well, there's some clues in here that help us determine that. One is Elvis's hair. Elvis was a naturally brownish blonde hair. He dyed his hair black, but he didn't start dyeing his hair black until early 57, interesting enough to look like one of his idols, the actor Tony Curtis. Secondly, gold belt and gold shoes. There's this famous photo of Elvis in a gold lame suit. It was actually one of his album covers. He didn't start wearing that suit until early 57. I was confident to be able to date this as May 31st, 1957 at Olympia with two of Elvis's favorite things, women and law enforcement.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this episode of Digging Detroit.